I wish I could describe in a fancy or unique manner how I found out my wife was cheating on me, but I can't. It happened just like a cliché from a poorly written story. I work at an auto parts factory, specifically making brakes. It's not glamorous work, but it pays the bills. I'm one of the fortunate ones. I spend 8 hours a day from 4 to midnight, 5 days a week, operating an ancient machine. I'm decked out in safety gear, eye protection, earplugs, steel-toed shoes, and a denim apron. I meet my daily quota, and if I'm lucky, I might get a bonus at year-end. I have a cozy 3-bedroom house, a lovely wife, and 2 sons in elementary school. After 12 years of marriage, things seemed stable. Until today. We have 5 stations assembling the brake shoes, all powered by compressed air. In the 8 years I've been here, we've had no issues with the equipment. However, today, halfway through the shift, the compressed air system malfunctioned. The air needs to be completely dry to function properly, filtered and dehydrated by automatic equipment. But today, it failed. The dehydrator system didn't expel the collected moisture as it should have. I'm no expert, but I know when moisture mixes with high-pressure air, everything freezes, and work comes to a standstill. Instead of waiting around, they sent us all home without pay, naturally. It's ironic, my whole life disrupted by high humidity. Upon entering the bedroom, I observed a scene where a hairy back was moving on top of my wife, Marcy. Naturally, I turned on the overhead light, realizing that Marcy wasn't asleep. She expressed annoyance at my presence, asking what I was doing there. I anticipated fear, apology, or shame from her, but instead she seemed angry. I inquired about her anger, to which she responded by accusing me of knowing exactly what was happening. She expressed regret that I had to witness the situation, but blamed me for not coming home on time. According to her, if I had been on time, the other person wouldn't have been there, and she wouldn't have been caught. The guy, previously obscured by the bed, now turned to glare at me with a smirk. Marcy half-heartedly pulled the covers up for modesty. My mistake was grabbing him as he got off the bed. He seemed much larger standing than lying down. For my trouble, I received 2 incredibly hard blows to the ribs. I never managed to land a punch. Before I knew it, I was on the floor, struggling to breathe. I think I got drub on the side of my head, and that's the last thing I remember. I woke up in the hospital emergency room, my ribs being bandaged by a medical technician. Marcy sat nearby, looking disgusted. The technician finished up and left the room. "Marcy, who was that guy, and why was he in our house?" "His name's Tony. He's a friend, and I invited him over." "You were with him? You were with him in our bed? Our kids were sleeping down the hall." "Yeah, I know. If you hadn't made a scene, they wouldn't have woken up. I had to get my sister to watch them so I could bring you here." "What was he doing here? How many times are you going to ask?" "Tony and I have been seeing each other for about 6 months. We were trying to keep it from you. We don't usually come here, but I couldn't find a sitter." "Is it over now?" "No, it's not. Danny, you're a good dad and husband, but Tony's great in bed. I don't see why we should end it just because you found out. But I promise we won't meet here anymore. It's not fair to you or the kids." "I'm sorry, Marcy. That's not okay. It ends now." "Danny, if you try to interfere with my relationship with Tony, you'll regret it. He smack you easily and he'll do it again. If you do anything, everyone will know you're a loser. Our friends, family, even your coworkers. Your life will be a nightmare. Don't you care what anyone thinks? You'd stoop that low just to hurt me?" "If I have to, but I doubt you'll risk it. Tony thinks you're a loser, and I agree. You'll have to live with it, Danny boy." "Who is he anyway? Where does he work?" "He doesn't work. He owns Continental Classics, the luxury car place on Lancaster Pike. You know, the one you always wanted to visit but never did. He's richer, smarter, and better in bed than you. He's also stronger and better with his fists." "Why not marry him if he's so great?" "That's why I keep you, darling. Tony doesn't want kids, and I won't give mine up. You'll play house while he gets the love. You either accept it or everyone will know what a loser you are. And by the way, I'm moving your stuff to the guest room. No need to share a bed now that it's out there." "Who watched the kids when you were with Tony?" "Usually Karen, sometimes your parents. Speaking of which, Karen introduced me to Tony. I'll thank her later." They discharged me the following morning. Marcy wasn't around. I debated calling someone or taking a taxi. The taxi won. With the kids at school and Marcy absent from home, all my clothes and personal belongings were stacked on the guest bed. I anticipated Todd and Terry might have questions about the situation, but I decided to let Marcy handle it. Setting up my new living space took less than an hour. Various thoughts raced through my mind. However, there was no way I was going to let things unfold as Marcy intended. My first move was retrieving my old phone recorder from the basement. Although it only functioned with the landline, it was my only option. Marcy primarily used her cell phone for calls. Setting it up and concealing it behind some old paint cans took about 20 minutes. It was a starting point. Feeling terrible, I still mustered up enough to return to work. They offered me pain pills, but I hesitated to take them and then operate machinery. Opting for a couple of heavy-duty Tylenols instead seemed like the better choice. Marcy had seriously misjudged my relationship with my coworkers. I divulged everything that occurred the previous evening to them. They all brainstormed ideas, some better than others. It was reassuring to know my friends had my back. With an 8-hour shift ahead, each of us planned to devise ways to set things right. During our mid-shift break for supper, Glenn spoke up first. "Any ideas?" "I don't have one, but I have a cousin who works for DeMarco. He does vehicle detailing and despises him. He could provide intel on the business, buildings, or work shifts," Glenn shared. "That would be helpful, Glenn. Anyone else?" "Danny?" Barry offered. "I have 2 muskets and 2 pistols. You're welcome to any of them. None are registered, so there's no concern there." "Thanks, Barry, but that's a bit more extreme than I was considering." "Don't even want to hear my idea," Freddie interjected, followed by some laughter. "Tell us, Freddie, come on," the group urged. "I thought we could tie him to a tree, legs spread, and build a bonfire Indian style between his legs." Although Freddie's idea was well received, it was unanimously rejected. Kyle, who hadn't shared yet, faced everyone's expectant gazes during lunch. "What? Don't give me that look." "Yeah, I've got an idea, but it's a bit out there." "Go on, Kyle." "I recall reading about a prison in Arizona that dressed love-making offenders in pink jumpsuits to humiliate them. I know Tony isn't a love offender, but something like that could embarrass him." "You mean put him in a pink jumpsuit? Wouldn't he just take it off?" "I was thinking if we could get to him, tie him up, and then spray paint him entirely with pink. That might do the trick, but he'd know who did it." "You've got to knock him out first, then leave him tied to the chair until he's discovered. Do we use medications or just punch him? What's your plan?" "I can grab a taser. All you have to do is sneak up and shock him. You're making it sound easier than it probably is. How do we catch him alone? And how do we approach without him noticing?" "I don't have all the answers. Just thought it was an idea." The buzzer signaled another 4 hours on the machines. My quota was down, so the other guys pitched in to help. Marcy was already in bed when I arrived home, keeping her promise not to bring him into the house. I had no clue what to do. Most of the ideas with the guys were like high school pranks. Might as well leave a flaming bag of dog poop on his doorstep. I needed genuine revenge. At noon, I got up. With the kids at school and Marcy moving around, I showered, shaved, and headed out. "Morning, husband. No kiss?" She smirked by the sink. Ignoring her, I left. Her comment didn't warrant a response. I needed lunch and alone time. The afternoon was spent killing time, figuring out how to get back at my wife's lover without causing trouble. Work awaited, and I needed to prepare. I decided to stop eating at home, the only time with the boys, but I couldn't stomach Marcy's cooking. Before I knew it, it was time for work. Things were normal until supper break when Carl announced proudly that he had a taser in the car for self-protection. He reminded Danny not to forget to pick it up and asked if Danny had ever used it. Danny replied that he hadn't, but they could try it out, eliciting groans from the others at the table. Despite the lack of new ideas, they all showed support for Danny, which made him feel better knowing he had friends. At home, the routine was ordinary, although working the graveyard shift had disrupted sleep patterns. Todd and Terry, up earlier than usual, suggested going to Chuck E. Cheese, which Marcy didn't mind since they'd be out all day. Marcy informed Danny that he would need to take a few vacation days as Tony's friend Wally would be visiting from Detroit next week, and they planned to go on a cruise to Cancun. She suggested that if Danny couldn't take the time off, he should ask his parents. Danny expressed skepticism about Marcy's plans, questioning her intention to go on a sea cruise with 2 guys. Marcy defended herself, saying it wasn't as questionable as Danny implied, and explained that Wally would be sharing a room with Karen, who had been friends with him for years. Danny responded sarcastically, acknowledging that it seemed dandy. He made a mental note to thank Karen later. Despite being up early, it seemed like it would be a long day. To pass time before Chuck E. Cheese opened, we visited the nearby Hobby Lobby. The boys were old enough to assemble most of the plastic models there. The end results weren't impressive, but they had a blast. I let them explore while I marveled at the crafts available for creative homemakers. If Marcy had been into crafts, maybe she wouldn't have brought home that hairy gorilla. Too late now. I was thrilled to find rows of designer paint and spray cans. There they were, 6 beautiful pink cans. They didn't hold as much as the ones at Lowe's or Home Depot, but they were pink. It was the only place I'd seen paint that color in a spray can. I took it as a sign and bought all 6. Todd chose a monster truck kit, and Terry picked a tugboat. Plastic tugboat models were news to me. Before leaving, I grabbed a package of 10 large plastic cable wraps about 18 inches long. They looked sturdy enough. Chuck E. Cheese was ready by then. The kids spent about 4 hours and 2 pizzas there before they got tired. We fed ducks in the park with cheap bread before heading to my parents' house. They were glad to have us for supper and the evening. Todd and Terry watched TV most of the night, while I briefed Dad on the situation with Marcy. I realized I was telling people about it before Marcy could. Her threat seemed less significant. Dad promised to take care of the boys, which eased my mind. Around 9 o'clock, I called Marcy to say we'd be staying at my parents' house. Got the machine. After a big breakfast at IHOP, we found Marcy still in bed. I started mowing the lawn while the boys worked on their models. Even though it was a beautiful day outside, I let them go. I decided to make a full day of the lawn work, including edging and pruning. Things didn't go as fast as usual because I found myself chatting a lot. I had hedge clippers but borrowed a set from Mike Fielding across the street. His wife, Mary, loved gossip. I warned Mike about unfamiliar cars at our house because Marcy would entertain male friends. If they got rowdy, he should call the police. It was hard for me to manage things since I work nights. Larry Finley, from the local church board, lent me a spark plug wrench. I apologized for Marcy's recent behavior. Of course, he was curious about what I meant. Larry was even more of a gossip than Mary Fielding. In just 10 minutes, he had enough gossip to last a month. I skipped lunch and wrapped up work around 4 in the afternoon. After a quick shower, I headed to Rosie's Cantina and treated myself to the priciest dish on the menu. I'm not exactly sure what it was, but it was delicious. I spent the evening with my brother Dave and his family. Dad had already filled him in on the situation. I crashed on his couch for the night. My wife had a grand scheme. She intended to coerce me into compliance by threatening to expose me as a betrayed man. If I didn't endorse and back her infidelity, she'd make my life hell. It was an intriguing plan, but it had many flaws. In less than a week, I'd already spilled the beans to everyone. That pretty much nullified her threat. I also managed to portray her as a cheap tramp more effectively than she could have imagined. I don't think she foresaw any backlash. The next afternoon, when I stopped by the house to change for work, Marcy was waiting for me, visibly upset. She mentioned that Karen had informed her about rumors circulating among the neighbors that she was running a brothel at night. I reassured her that I had simply told the neighbors that she might have male visitors while I was at work and advised them not to be concerned about it. However, Marcy insisted that the rumors were spreading differently and asked who else I had spoken to. I admitted that I had spoken to everyone, thinking it would be easier that way. I hadn't mentioned anything to her parents or sisters and suggested she handle that before they heard the rumors. Marcy expressed frustration, feeling like the rumors were making her look bad. In response, I pointed out that the situation wasn't fair to me either, as it made me appear like a betrayed man. Marcy apologized but said she had to leave for work. She mentioned that she had managed to spend some time with the boys before leaving, though it wasn't the quality time she had hoped for. Glenn had some great news that night. Continental Classic shut down at 9 o'clock on Thursday night, so Tony could personally handle all the paychecks for Friday. He hated being disturbed while doing payroll, so even the cleaning crew was gone. Kyle took a few minutes to show me how to use the taser. No one volunteered to test it. The plan was falling into place. If I got caught, and I fully expected to, I'd likely face jail time. I didn't care. Tony DeMarco needed to be humiliated. If I got arrested, I'd ensure all newspapers and TV stations got the full story. Any publicity like that would crush him, or at least infuriate him enough to make a mistake. For the next few days, I only went home to sleep, shower, and change clothes. I hadn't eaten a meal at home since that first day. Finally, Thursday arrived. I arranged for my truck to have a dead battery, so Kyle picked me up. The floor supervisor rarely bothered the brake guys too much. As long as we met our quotas and maintained quality, they left us alone. The OSHA requirements for the job would work in my favor. With our apron gloves and welding goggles, we all looked pretty much the same. At 8:30, I slipped out the back door. The guys would take turns covering for me at my station. One of their posts would be empty, but no one really cared. Toilet breaks were normal and unregulated. The main thing was to create the illusion that I never left. I entered the staff entrance at Continental Classics and headed directly to the restroom. Around 9 o'clock, someone quickly checked the area before turning off the lights. 10 minutes later, I donned latex gloves and exited the restroom into a dimly lit office area. Tony's desk overlooked the showroom, so his back was turned to the door. It seemed easier than I had anticipated. Despite having a computer in front of him, he was using an old adding machine with paper tape. He didn't hear my approach. I zapped Tony with the taser on the back of his neck. His body idioted upright, and fearing he might turn around, I administered another shock. This time, he twitched a bit before relaxing. Perfect. I secured 2 plastic cable wraps on each limb and brought along an old necktie to use as a blindfold. He cooperated without resistance. I rolled his chair to the showroom window. He would be perfectly visible when his staff arrived for work in the morning. The paint, a pretty pink color, required more coats than expected. It was absorbed into his clothing quickly, necessitating at least 3 coats in each area to achieve the desired effect. I just had enough paint, but barely. He looked quite striking in pink. After completing the task, I carefully packed everything back up. I had anticipated Tony waking up during the process, but he remained still. I had also planned to remove the necktie blindfold before leaving. I checked my watch several times, well within the time frame I had set, but I still wanted Tony awake before I left. 5 minutes later, I started to worry. I attempted to feel for a pulse without success. Perhaps the latex gloves hindered my sensitivity. I removed one glove and tried again, but still no pulse. Trying to find a pulse on his neck like on TV yielded nothing. I removed the blindfold and touched his eyeball with a pencil tip. No blink, no reflex. Needless to say, panic set in. I regained my composure, put the latex glove back on, and wiped everything I might have touched. I pocketed the necktie and cut off all the plastic ties. Removing them revealed marks from the pink paint, which looked odd. The white skin under the necktie made him resemble a pink raccoon. After ensuring I didn't overlook anything, I left for work. On the way back to the shop, I disposed of all items, including the taser, in a storm sewer. 10 minutes later, I was back at work making brake shoes. No one noticed my absence. After the shift ended, I informed the guys of what happened. They were all accessories, so I was confident nobody would speak up. Freddie was impressed, and none of them seemed concerned. Kyle drove me home, and we both noted the time of his drop-off. I didn't manage to sleep as long as usual. Around 10 o'clock, Marcy burst into my room. "What on earth did you do? What did you do, you little idiot?" Naturally, I just rolled over and gave her a puzzled look. "What in the world are you talking about, woman? Tony's dead. Karen called and said they found him in his office this morning. Dead. I suspect you had something to do with it. And I'll make sure you pay, you idiot." That was the second time she called me an idiot in 5 minutes. It was pretty clear I wouldn't be getting any more sleep, so I stumbled out of bed and went to the bathroom. Not eager to face Marcy's wrath, I took a long, hot shower and shaved slowly. I even put on a bit of aftershave just to annoy my dear wife. I never made it to the coffee pot. A tall man stood in the living room conversing with Marcy. His hair was closely cropped and he wore a dark suit. The witch had called the cops, no doubt about it. I shook my head and headed into the kitchen for my first cup of the day. Marcy wore a sarcastic smirk as I settled into my favorite recliner. My uninvited guest followed suit. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Detective Darnell Green with an E. I'm here regarding the pass-away of Anthony DeMarco last night. Your wife mentioned you and Mr. DeMarco had a disagreement last week, and I was wondering if I could ask you a few questions." "Sure, no objections, but not here." "What do you mean? If you want to talk, let's do it in your office, not in my home. Is that okay with you?" I couldn't help but notice the frown on Marcy's face. I was pretty sure she had expected to be part of the conversation. "Your car or mine, Mr. Mercer?" "I have a few other things to attend to, so I'll meet you there." "Any particular office?" "Second floor, rear room 206. Just turn right when you get off the elevator. I'll see you shortly." Marcy was seething as I put on my shoes. I never got around to finishing the coffee, so I dumped it in the sink. I turned and smiled as I walked out the door. "I guess you'll get what you wanted, sweetheart." "What are you talking about? What do you mean, Danny?" 10 minutes later, I was seated with Detective Green on the second floor of the municipal building. For the next hour, Detective Green asked all the pertinent questions, and I provided suitable answers. He delicately broached the topic of the affair without dwelling on it or being overly blunt. Naturally, I had to acknowledge having a motive, but I insisted I never had the opportunity to act on it. It was a serious matter, but I endeavored to be cooperative without being cheeky. I think he appreciated my efforts to make his job easier, even though I couldn't provide a definitive answer. The most intriguing part of the conversation was learning that Tony passed away due to a heart issue. He had a pacemaker put in a couple of years back, which apparently didn't mesh well with the taser. They deduced the taser's involvement from the marks on his neck. I felt remorseful about Tony's pass away, yet there was also a sense of relief. Detective Green gave me the customary "don't leave town" spiel and mentioned he'd contact me after confirming my alibi. It was unexpected. I never imagined needing an alibi for anything. It was kind of thrilling. We parted on good terms, and I sensed that Darnell Green was supportive, which was comforting. After grabbing a quick meal, I tuned into the TV news. There was a segment about the demise of a local businessman, noting he had no relatives in the area. I withdrew funds from the bank accounts and then treated myself to a nice breakfast. There were tasks to attend to at home. Marcy wasn't around when I returned. It took me half an hour to relocate all my belongings to the master bedroom and hers to the guest room. The guest room had limited storage space, so I piled her things on the bed for her to organize. I checked the telephone recorder in the basement, finding nothing noteworthy. I gathered banking, insurance records, and other vital documents. Thankfully, Marcy's Volvo was in my name, simplifying matters. I stashed everything in a folder under the front seat of my truck. I phoned work and took a 2-week vacation. A few hours later, my beloved wife arrived. She seemed taken aback to find me at home. It was time to set things straight again. I grinned as I escorted her to the guest room. "What's this? Who do you think you are?" Her response was a smirk. "Tell me, damn it, what's happening, Marcy?" "I'll be using the master bedroom from now on. You can have the guest room. I suggest you start putting away your clothes. Anything left out by dinner will be disposed of. Any questions?" "I can't fit my stuff in that tiny closet. And I won't stay in that room anyway. What do you mean, disposed of?" "If it doesn't fit in the closet or dresser, you don't need it. This is non-negotiable. Danny, you're in trouble. Get your act together. If you need clarification, ask later." Idiot. That was the 3rd time that day she called me an idiot. I must be making some progress. While Marcy was occupied in the guest room, I emptied her purse on the kitchen table. I meticulously collected what I wanted. First, I took her cell phone and car keys. From her wallet, I removed her driver's license, credit cards, debit cards, and cash. I replaced the remaining items. I retrieved her car title from the pickup and drove her Volvo to a friend who owned a car lot across town. I sold it to him outright at a fair price, with the understanding he'd sell it wholesale out of town. Even after settling the loan, I pocketed a few $1,000s. As I headed into Taco Bell for lunch, my cell phone rang. "You witch! Where's my cell phone and where's my car?" I was relieved she didn't call me in schmirk this time. She was calling from the house phone. It was a good test. I could check the recorder later. "I'm sorry, honey. I had to get money to hire a lawyer for the homicide charges. I promised to get you another car once I'm out of jail," I said, ending the call and turning off the cell phone. After that conversation, I realized getting a lawyer was crucial. No matter what happened, I was determined not to stay married. But I had to wait. I was next in line to order. Todd and Terry were home when I arrived. I went straight to my sons, ignoring Marcy. I did glance her way a few times and noticed she wasn't happy. The boys eagerly showed me their models. When Marcy began preparing dinner, I wandered to the guest room. My clothes were back on the bed, Marcy's in the master bedroom. I chuckled, but chose not to argue. She seemed stubborn and resolute. Marcy instructed the boys to wash up for dinner, and I returned to the guest room to unpack. I would have loved to discard her belongings, but that seemed too immature. Red Lobster was my treat tonight. Money wasn't an issue. I still had cash after the lawyer's deposit. The shrimp and lobster combo was delicious, but the cheese rolls remained my favorite. After finishing, I switched on my cell phone, hoping for a call from work or Detective Green. The first call I received was from my wife, who asked how she could go to the grocery store to pick up some items, including milk. I assured her that I would take her when I returned, and suggested planning our shopping trips for Saturdays when I was off work. I expressed a preference for her not to go alone and mentioned another call coming in, prompting me to end our conversation with plans to talk later. The second call was from Kyle, who informed me that Detective Green had spoken to the entire crew individually and as a group, and everyone's stories had checked out. He mentioned that Tom Tingle, the floor manager, had strongly supported him, emphasizing that Kyle couldn't have missed work. After arriving home just in time to tuck the boys in, I found Marcy sitting on the couch with wine. I grabbed a cold Foster's and settled into my recliner, hoping to initiate a conversation. I asked Marcy about her plan to paint me as a villain, which abruptly ended the conversation. Marcy finished her wine, left for her bedroom, and I realized she didn't actually want to talk. Disappointed, I grabbed my beer and checked the recorder. The first call was to her sister, no cover-up there. It seemed Marge knew about the affair with Tony and supported Marcy. That was reassuring. The next call to Marcy's mom was different. Mom was clueless. Her daughter convinced her that Tony was a friend of Karen's, and I was jealous because I'd been pursuing Karen for years. Although she didn't directly accuse me of homicide, it was heavily implied. She contacted the cell phone company to inquire about a replacement for the phone I took but had no luck. Then, she reached out to the DMV to report the loss of her driver's license, and they advised her to inform the police. When she called the bank to request a new credit card, she discovered the account was closed. I'll give her this. She was quite active. The final call on the machine was to Karen. Even though Karen lived nearby, they opted for a phone call instead of meeting in person. It worked out in my favor, of course. From that call, I gleaned two important details. Wally was still coming from Detroit, and Marcy planned to keep a low profile until his arrival. The next day, the boys and I were up early and out of the house before Marcy woke up. We returned home after lunch, and Marcy insisted I drive her to the grocery store since she lacked a car and driver's license. That evening, while she prepared dinner, I checked the recorder. Wally had arrived and immediately called Marcy. Their conversation was intriguing. He believed Marcy's story and vowed revenge. Wally and Tony were childhood friends, and he was adamant about seeking justice. He provided Marcy with his contact information and instructed her to call him the following day. Afterward, Marcy excitedly phoned Karen, expressing her happiness. It was hard to believe this was the same woman I'd been married to for years. The transformation was sudden and complete. I never imagined my actions, aside from confronting her lover, warranted such a drastic change. Before turning in, I grabbed a burger. Knowing the lawn needed mowing again, I used it as an excuse to avoid Marcy the next day. Around 11 o'clock, Marcy's parents arrived to pick up the boys for an unplanned sleepover. But I didn't object. Grandma Wilcox assured they'd be back in time for school tomorrow. Eager to check the phone recorder, I postponed until after lunch since I skipped breakfast. Following a quick shower, I headed to Denny's. Marcy made no mention of my absence from home. She and Wally had devised a plan to avenge Tony's pass away, which seemed somewhat absurd to me given my knowledge of the situation. Their plan involved Wally entering the house through the back deck's sliding door, while Marcy assured him it would be unlocked if all went well. It was meant to appear as a burglary gone wrong, with me being shot. Both Marcy and Karen were to call emergency upon hearing the gunshot. At that moment, I realized I hadn't updated my insurance policy beneficiaries. As I left, I sarcastically blew a kiss to my wife, receiving a finger in return. I had dinner with my parents and stayed the evening. Before leaving, I borrowed Dad's snake charmer, a short-barreled 20-gauge, for the upcoming event. Marcy was in bed when I returned home, her light on, presumably reading. The lone message on the answering machine came from Karen, boasting about her and Wally's pleasurable afternoon. Before signing off, she assured Marcy of her readiness later that night. It took me roughly 20 minutes to swap out the buckshot in the shells with rock salt, using a leftover bag from last winter. My intention wasn't to eliminate Wally, but merely to slow him down. Honestly, I didn't wish damage upon Tony either. I hoped Wally didn't have a bad heart like Tony did. Wanting to check the back deck door, I hesitated, fearing Wally might spot me. I had to assume Marcy left it unlocked. I stripped down to my shorts and mussed up the bed blankets. A cup of coffee would have been preferable, but since none was available, I settled for a drink, waiting in my recliner with the cell phone close by. He didn't arrive until after midnight. Upon spotting him on the deck, I promptly dialed emergency, reporting an intruder in my house and expressing fear for my life, keeping the line open. The patio door slid open quietly, revealing Wally. I waited until he was fully inside the house before delivering the first blast. I aimed for his lower body to avoid accidental pass away. The first shot knocked him back under the deck. With the second shot, he tumbled over the deck's side, breaking the railing. I knew I hadn't eliminated him as he howled in pain. Man, that rock salt must have caused quite the sting. I was amazed at how deafening the musket blast sounded indoors. My ears were ringing intensely. When I flipped on the lights, Marcy was already in the living room screaming. Although she was shouting at me, her words were unintelligible. I approached to check on Wally and noticed a Ruger .22 automatic pistol with a silencer on the floor. Marcy continued to scream, so I aimed the musket in her direction, causing her to quickly quiet down and flee the room. It appeared Wally had broken his ankle in the fall. Some guys seemed to have all the luck. 10 minutes later, the first police car arrived. There wasn't much discussion. I placed the musket on the floor to avoid any confusion about the situation. Pointing to the phone, I informed the officers that everything was under control. When asked about other occupants, I mentioned Marcy in the bedroom. Bringing her into the living room, the officers realized their mistake. Despite their attempts to quiet her, both Marcy and I were unsuccessful. Finally, a large female officer gently escorted her outside. I noticed Karen standing with some neighbors outside. I grinned at her and gestured across my throat, but she quickly walked away without reciprocating. The EMTs arrived for Wally as Detective Green showed up. He smiled at me, and I couldn't help but grin back. It wasn't intentional sass, but I couldn't resist. The female officer escorted Marcy back inside so she could dress. After getting dressed, we all headed to the police headquarters. I requested separate cars, and Detective Green agreed to let me ride with him. We didn't speak on the way downtown, but he smiled at me again. It was daylight when Green released me. Although we only spoke for about 30 minutes, they kept me at the station all night, making me drink coffee. One of the police cars drove me home. I was disappointed not to see yellow tape around the house. Everything looked normal, and even the rock salt hadn't damaged the glass door. Wally seemed to have borne the brunt of it. I estimated it would take about an hour to fix the broken railing. I went to bed and didn't wake up until after lunch. After relieving myself, I stumbled into the kitchen to find my amiable detective seated at the table, engrossed in the newspaper and sipping fresh coffee, which I presumed he brewed while I slept. Having had my fill of coffee the night before, I opted for a tall glass of orange juice and settled across from him. How he entered the house eluded me. "You're quite the chill guy, Mr. Mercer," he remarked, his eyes fixed on the paper. Uncertain how to reply, I remained silent, unsure if he was toying with me. Finishing his coffee, he finally spoke. "Detective Green, I need a shower, a shave, and some lunch. I'll treat, unless it violates some police protocol." "Take your time, Danny. I've got all day." Heading to the shower, I pondered when he found time to sleep. Lunch comprised 2 hefty pulled pork sandwiches, and Green even joined me in washing them down with a beer. As the silence grew palpable, he broke it. "You were itching to ask me questions, weren't you, Mr. Mercer?" "Funny, I had the same thought about you," I retorted. Green flagged down the waiter for 2 more drafts. "I spent the whole night grilling you. Now it's your turn." "All right, first off, where's my wife?" "She's still in custody. Charges will be filed this afternoon." Downing my beer, I processed the unexpected news. I had a flood of inquiries, but delving deeper risked exposing myself. Opting to retreat, I remarked, "Nice to see Marcy's folks rallying for her." "As I won't be." "No more questions, Detective Green. But if you need to spill, go ahead." He chuckled, taking a swig. "One more thing. Did you happen to overhear or record any conversations between your wife and Mr. Williams?" "You mean Wally?" That earned me a smirk. "If I did have such a recording, would you want it?" "I'm unsure. If things unfold as I anticipate, it may not matter. But if they get skilled lawyers, having such evidence could be troublesome, right?" "You're onto something. I'm just trying to streamline my job. I'll manage without a hypothetical tape." I nodded slightly. "Thanks, Danny boy. I think I should drive you home. Your boys will return from school soon, needing their father." We reached the house just as Todd and Terry disembarked from the school bus. They approached us, and I introduced them to my new detective companion. Eager to see his badge, they expressed interest. However, the mood shifted when Green inquired, "So, who built the tugboat and who assembled the monster truck?" "I built the truck!" Todd exclaimed proudly, while Terry declared, "I did the tugboat. Want to see it?" With a promise of possibly inspecting them another time, Terry departed, leaving me stunned as he walked to his car with a satisfied grin. He knew about the pink paint predicament, holding the upper hand. Helpless, we ordered pizza for dinner, and the boys didn't inquire about their mom's whereabouts. After supper, Marcy's dad called, seeking assistance to raise bail money for her release from jail. Politely declining, I wondered if he truly comprehended the situation, but at least he tried to be a supportive father. Inquiring about her accommodation, he hesitated before stating she would stay with them. We assisted in loading Marcy's belongings into the pickup and dropped them off without issue. Returning home, I noticed a U-Haul truck in Karen's driveway, vanished the next morning. Marcy never reached out, leaving me to glean updates from the daily newspaper. I felt deliberately excluded from the unfolding events. There was no trial. Marcy pinned all blame on Wally, who countered it was her idea. Both accepted pleas, with Marcy receiving 3 to 5 years for conspiracy to commit homicide, and Wally receiving 5 to 10 years for attempted homicide. Federal authorities were consulted regarding Wally's silencer, but postponed action until he completed his initial sentence. Detective Green didn't require the tape and ceased mentioning it. Karen disappeared without a trace. My dad reclaimed his musket, jesting that I might need it again. Chuckling, he mentioned Marcy served me with divorce papers. Once her jail term began, she didn't contest anything. I sensed she wanted nothing to do with me since I hadn't seen or spoken to her since the night I shot Wally. I sold the house and moved back in with my parents as I couldn't balance work and caring for the boys alone. My colleagues welcomed me back, and although offered a switch to the day shift, I declined. I regularly took the boys to visit their mother at Muncie Women's Prison. During these visits, I remained in the car, typically less than an hour, sometimes outdoors in good weather, observing them through the chain-link fence. I refrained from discussing the visits with them and requested they not share any details. It seemed to suit all of us well, and everything seemed to be going smoothly until I received the phone call. "Hello, is this Daniel Mercer?" "Yes." "I'm Angela Hawkins. Detective Darnell Green suggested I reach out to you. There are matters we need to discuss." "I'm aware. But why do you want to talk to me?" "Tony DeMarco was my brother." "Oh, damn. Just when I thought I'd put all this behind me. Now this." "I understand, but I don't think avoiding this conversation is wise. I'm sorry for your loss, but I can't assist you." I ended the call before she could say more. 2 days later, she called again. "Daniel, I'd appreciate it if we could meet. There are things I need to address. Detective Green mentioned you're reasonable. Where should we meet?" "I'd prefer the auto showroom, but anywhere you're comfortable is fine." It took me a moment to respond. "Let's meet Saturday at 10 o'clock at the showroom. I'll bring my sons. They enjoy old cars." Unsure of her intentions, I felt safer in public with the boys. I didn't want to use them as a shield, but I believed she'd be less inclined to cause trouble with them present. I speculated about her potential grudge, assuming she might be Italian and hot-blooded. Eventually, I concluded I was overthinking and needed a beer. I called Detective Green for insight. He chuckled, advising me to meet with her and stop fretting. Easy for him to say, as he wasn't the one who eliminated her brother. Continental Classics was an expansive and impressive establishment. Apart from the main showroom, they possessed 2 sizable buildings in the rear, housing cars awaiting restoration or awaiting display on the showroom floor. It came as a shock when we arrived to find them hosting a grand opening celebration. I hadn't anticipated it. There were many aspects of the event that puzzled me. Terry and Todd appeared torn between the cars and the complimentary items. My first impression was the scent emanating from the popcorn machine. A man clad in floppy shoes and a rubber nose distributed small bags of freshly popped kernels, while adjacent stood a soda machine and another clown manning a hot dog cart. It seemed the boys wouldn't require lunch today. Angela Hawkins wasn't difficult to identify. The moment I observed her striding purposefully towards me, I recognized her immediately. Everything about her exuded Italian heritage: dark hair, eyes, olive complexion, and broad hips. While a gentleman might not have noticed the latter, they were accentuated by her stature, barely reaching 5 feet. Tony was colossal, whereas his sister was short and stout. I felt a twinge of anxiety as she approached, then noticed the miniature version of her by her side, a young girl of about 10, bearing a striking resemblance to Angela, albeit with lighter hair and naturally lacking any hips at all. It appeared my hostess employed the same tactic as I did for security, as we both relied on our children. As she closed the distance between us, her hand extended in a friendly gesture. "Daniel Mercer, I presume?" It felt only natural and polite to shake her hand, reminiscent of a scene from a movie about Dr. Livingston. Though she wore a smile, she seemed slightly nervous, which eased my own apprehension. I stood there silently, prompting her to continue speaking. It felt as though I were deliberately being excluded from the loop. There was no trial. Marcy pinned all the blame on Wally, who in turn claimed it was her idea. Both eventually pleaded guilty, with Marcy receiving 3 to 5 years for conspiracy to commit homicide, and Wally 5 to 10 years for attempted homicide. Federal authorities became involved due to the silencer Wally possessed, opting to await the completion of his initial sentence before taking further action. Detective Green never revisited the issue of the tape. Karen disappeared without a trace. My father was pleased to retrieve his musket and joked that I could borrow it again if needed. He chuckled as he said so. Marcy served with divorce papers. Upon commencing her jail term, she didn't contest anything. I sensed she wanted nothing to do with me since I hadn't seen or spoken to her since the night I shot Wally. Selling the house, I returned to live with my parents as I couldn't juggle work and childcare alone. My co-workers welcomed me back, and though offered a switch to the day shift, I declined. I regularly took the boys to visit their mother at Muncie Women's Prison, waiting in the car during their brief meetings, sometimes outdoors in good weather. I refrained from questioning them about the visits, asking them not to divulge anything. This arrangement seemed to suit us all well, and everything appeared to be running smoothly until I received the phone call. "Hello? Is this Daniel Mercer?" "Yes. I'm Angela Hawkins. Detective Darnell Green recommended I call you. There are things we need to discuss." "I understand, Detective Green. But why do you want to talk to me?" "Tony DeMarco was my brother." "Oh, darn. Just when I thought all this was over. Why does this have to happen?" "I don't think that's a wise idea. I'm sorry for your loss, but I can't assist you." I ended the call before she could say more. 2 days later, she called again. "Daniel, I'd appreciate it if you could meet me. There are some things I need to say. Detective Green mentioned you're reasonable. Where would you like to meet?"
"I'd prefer the auto showroom, but anywhere you're comfortable works."
It took me a moment to decide.
"I'll meet you Saturday morning at 10 o'clock at the showroom.
I'll bring my 2 sons. They enjoy looking at old cars." I didn't know her intentions, but felt safer in public with my boys. I wasn't using them as a shield, but hoped she'd be less likely to do anything. I realized I was overthinking. I needed a beer. I called Detective Green, who laughed and advised me to meet with her and stop worrying. Easy for him, he didn't eliminate her brother. Continental Classics was an impressive place with a main showroom and 2 large buildings at the back for cars needing restoration or display. I was surprised to find they were having a grand opening celebration. There were many things I didn't understand. Terry and Todd seemed torn between the cars and the freebies. The first thing that caught my attention was the smell of the popcorn machine. A person with floppy shoes and a rubber nose was handing out small bags of hot popped kernels. Nearby, there was a soda machine and another person with a hot dog cart. The boys wouldn't need lunch today. It wasn't too hard to recognize Angela Hawkins. I knew right away as she walked directly toward me with a slow and determined stride. Everything about her exuded Italian heritage. Dark hair, dark eyes, olive complexion, and broad hips. I suppose a gentleman wouldn't notice her hips, but they were emphasized by her height, barely 5 feet tall. Tony appeared imposing, and his sister had a sturdy build. I felt a bit uneasy as she approached, but my apprehension lessened when I noticed the smaller version of her by her side, a young girl of around 10 who closely resembled Angela, albeit with lighter hair and a less developed physique. It seemed we both found comfort in the presence of our children, a somewhat pathetic realization. As she came closer, she extended her hand in a friendly gesture, addressing me as Daniel Mercer. I shook her hand, feeling a sense of familiarity akin to a scene from a movie about Dr. Livingston. Despite her smile, she seemed slightly nervous, which helped ease my own discomfort. I chose to remain silent, prompting her to continue speaking. She expressed her intention for both of us to learn the business thoroughly enough to take control, emphasizing the need for me to assert myself in the meantime. Angela admitted that she was a nice person, which led Tony and his wife to attempt to take advantage of her. Her tone became more relaxed as she remarked on the unsuccessful outcome for Tony and his wife. I found her comment oddly amusing and chuckled. Over the next half hour, we discussed the terms of our arrangement. Angela offered better pay and benefits compared to my factory job, with the option to return if things didn't work out, although I hoped they would. Todd looked unwell on the way home, likely from too many hot dogs and sodas. Meanwhile, Terry seemed to enjoy himself, chatting with Carla more than inspecting cars. A positive sign. Todd got sick in the truck and skipped supper. I started work the following Monday. Things unfolded as Angela predicted. I quickly familiarized myself with the operation and gained support from employees, particularly Glenn's cousin, my staunchest ally. Most wanted the business to thrive and readily reported any misconduct. Angela delegated firings to me, a task I surprisingly relished. I lived up to my reputation. Detective Green visited for coffee often, though our conversations remained light. Eventually, he shared a personal story. 3 years ago, I was a cop in Philly. I returned home one day to find my wife in bed with my supervisor. I attacked them and threw my wife out. The department gave me the ultimatum to quit or be fired. A week later, I found work here. Before leaving, I ensured my wife's lover lost his job. I didn't press for more details. At least now, I understood why he seemed to favor my side. The boys agreed not to inform their mother about my new job. During visits, they casually mentioned the lengthy drive, but understood it was unavoidable. I felt it was crucial for Marcy to see her sons, not for her sake, but to inflict emotional pain. I know it's a terrible way to involve your kids, but I derived some twisted pleasure from it. Angela and I were spending more time together at and after work. One weekend, the boys insisted on taking her and Carla to Nobles Grove. Mostly we stayed close to home due to our living situations complicating any romantic prospects. While I was keen on a closer relationship with Angela, it wasn't feasible. I still resided with my parents and the boys, while Angela and Carla shared a small studio apartment. Since the business exceeded expectations, Angela discussed purchasing a house. She spent hours online searching for the perfect one. My first realization came when she mentioned wanting a 4-bedroom home for the boys. "Danny, I think it's important for each boy to have their own room. It's better to address this now than later. Don't you agree?" I recognized the question as a setup and sensed Angela viewed me as more than just an employee. The possibility of romance seemed promising. "Yeah, I think that's a great idea. A split bedroom plan would also be beneficial. I don't like the idea of them being too close to the master bedroom," I added before leaving the office. Angela sported a small smile, marking our peculiar relationship. Though we never engaged in lovemaking or closeness acts, I felt closer to her than I did to Marcy in 12 years. 2 days after finalizing my divorce from Marcy, we all celebrated at Red Lobster. While the kids were unaware of the reason, Angela knew. Later at the apartment, while the kids watched a pay-per-view movie, Angela kissed me in the kitchen. We hugged and giggled until Carla caught us. "Whoops! Sorry, Mom," she said before adding, "It's about time." Angela and I behaved ourselves for the remainder of the evening, eagerly anticipating what lay ahead. The following day, while the kids were at school, Angela and I decided to take an extended lunch break and return to the apartment with a sense of pent-up energy. We didn't resume work until just before the end of the workday. As time went on, we continued to take numerous extended lunches, and Angela became increasingly serious about finding a new house. Detective Green would often drop by for casual visits, sometimes admiring the cars. He developed a liking for a Studebaker Hawk previously owned by Roger Ebert, and Angela offered him a good price for it. Unexpectedly, Angela requested that I take her to see Marcy. Despite our reduced number of trips, Marcy didn't seem to object. I asked if there was a specific reason for the visit, to which Angela replied, "Closure." Although I understood the term, the concept felt somewhat abstract to me. I offered to accompany her, but Angela insisted that I simply drive her there, stating that I didn't need to be present during the conversation. On a warm, sunny fall day, we arrived at Muncie. Since the inmate visits were held outside, I parked by the fence. 10 minutes later, Marcy and Angela emerged into the exercise yard and sat at a table, chatting and smiling as if they were old friends. Things took an unexpected turn. After 5 minutes, Marcy's smile vanished, and she leaned across the picnic table, scowling at her visitor. Meanwhile, Angela remained cheerful. Suddenly, Marcy lunged across the table, attempting to grab Angela. The commotion was swiftly quelled by several guards who escorted my ex-wife back into the building, where she protested vehemently. Angela glanced at me, smiled, and shrugged before departing the visitors' area. She was still grinning when she returned to the car. "What was that all about?" I questioned. "Your ex-wife is quite touchy," Angela remarked with a hint of amusement. After driving for several miles, she turned slightly, straining against the seatbelt. I introduced myself, and she seemed pleased to see me. Everything was fine until she thought I was on her side. I admit I may have misled her a bit at first. "How so?" I inquired. I told her I came from Baltimore seeking revenge. That seemed to satisfy her because she thought I meant against you. "Absolutely. What I really meant was that I intended to seek retribution against Tony by assuming control of his business. I suppose you can still seek revenge against a deceased person, right?" "All right, but what caused her to become so upset?" "She wanted specifics, like when, where, and how." Naturally, I knew she was referring to you. Now I was becoming intrigued. I informed her that it would take a considerable amount of time and inquired if she wished to be kept updated on the progress. She eagerly consented and insisted on knowing precisely how I planned to accomplish it. When I divulged my strategy, she became furious. She completely lost her composure. It was quite remarkable. All right. How on earth do you plan to eliminate me?" "No, I genuinely want to know." Her smile widened. "I informed her that I intended to exhaust you to pass away." "That's all?" "Indeed. Isn't it amusing? I thought she might become angry, but I never anticipated her reaction to be so extreme." There was a brief moment of silence. We both sat there smiling. I felt immensely proud of her. "When do you intend to commence this endeavor?" "As soon as we arrive at the next motel, silly." 2 months later, Angela and I tied the knot. It was in carnal ceremony in the backyard of our new residence. Angela sent Marcy a wedding invitation along with a brief note enclosed. "Everything is proceeding as planned. You should be deceased in 40 or 50 years.